Hey everybody. The first class on health and the caring professions, HCS 201. I'm going to be doing a series of these just sort of much shorter, I wouldn't even call them lectures, but sort of just talking points about the assignments and the themes of each individual class that make up this course. And just some things to focus on and think about as you do the assignments, and also things you've mentioned in your SAC papers that have made an impression on me, and I've written them down. I'd like them to be seen by all of you. So this is the first one, and again, I'll keep these short because I know you have to actually do all the work and then write it up in the midst of whatever you're doing. So these will not be long, but this first class sets the tone. This first set of readings and video set the tone for a lot of the things we'll be covering in this class on health and the caring professions. If you've taken HCS 100 or U.S. healthcare, that focuses a lot more on economics, on policy, on organization, sort of like the business political side of healthcare, which is huge. And in that class, you see how all the trade-offs are involved, and you realize how massive the healthcare system is. We learn about public health, we learn about different issues like geriatrics and all of that, but we kind of learn from sometimes at a 30,000 foot level, a policy, economic, abstract level. And I don't know if you've ever been sitting in those classes. I know as someone who teaches it, I think sometimes what's getting lost is the fact that all of those big numbers and pie charts and graphs are aggregations of individual encounters in healthcare. So, 4 million deliveries of obstetric deliveries every year. That's a number. It's almost numbing. That's 4,000 healthcare medical interaction experiences that are deeply profound and moving and life-changing for people who are in them. And so this class is more like, how does that play out down on the micro level? So U.S. healthcare, HCS 100 is sort of it tends to be more the macro, big picture, continental, constellational view of healthcare. HCS 201 is, come on back down here to reality in the trenches of what it's like to be a patient, what it's like to be a care provider, a clinician, a doctor, a nurse, dentist, PA, respiratory therapist. What's it like to be a caregiver in the family? What's it like to be a patient? So it's much more of a personal, experiential view, because once you aggregate all those, then you get all big numbers in the policy. But it's the same. They interact with each other, and it's good to know both, because if you only know one, it's like all you've done is arms and you've done no workout with your legs, or you've just done legs. This gives you the balance. And this first class on narrative medicine and bioethics, you have these issues of empathy and how do you see patients, and how personal should your motivation be as a clinician? How much should it be about empathy? How much should it be about your own pride? How much should it be about money? How do you deal with burnout? Even the issue of denial. Denial has such a bad connotation to it. Like, oh my gosh, you don't want to be in denial about anything. And yet, as you read the article about denial is almost like a basic part of our human survival kit, of how sometimes you need an element of denial or a partial denial to just give your mind and your emotions enough time to sort of manage a bad piece of news or a terminal diagnosis. Or denial is actually in different amounts, and it's a survival mechanism. And if you just say, okay, no denial, you just got to deal with it. And you see this often in healthcare. Here's a diagnosis, deal with it. You're missing something that is profound on the patient side, that it's hurtful, and the better clinicians know that the harder the news, the slower you have to go, the more you have to repeat it, the more you have to build in some empathy, or you're really doing damage. So that's what this first class is. And then also we have the great TED Talk about millennials in medicine, which is a great mix at the end about, yes, there are these issues with healthcare. These are these issues with empathy, and the business side of healthcare sometimes undercuts the human side. But you can't give up. You can't just let the system wear you down. There's systems all over like education systems. Sometimes you're like, wait a minute, are universities putting students always at the most important point of decision making? Are they sometimes doing what's better for professors in the school? Well, yeah, it happens sometimes. It happens in every organization, in every sector. Sometimes the people that should be front and center aren't. But you got to fight. You got to push back. You got to find ways to make that not a reality. So this is a great New Yorker cartoon. Ah, Mr. Bromley, nice to put a face on a disease. I've read it in your SAG papers. I've heard it from people who shadowed that a lot of doctors, when they get medical residents or interns or early residents, they're sometimes like, wow, these young adults are so smart. I mean, they know all the biochemical and biomedical reactions, the chemistry, they know, but they're just leaving patients cold. They don't have that emotional, social intelligence that is so important. If you've ever dealt with like a therapist or your school counselor or just someone in your family who's just totally unfiltered and blunt, it can make life very difficult. And you're working in healthcare, you're often delivering messages people don't want to hear. And, people aren't diseases. Someone is not autistic. A person has autism. A person is not, it's not, you can think of other examples. They're not the disease, they're not, I don't know, they're not a schizophrenic. They have schizophrenia. And even people who are not sick now will be eventually. So, you go from being the caregiver to being the care recipient. And as many of you mentioned in your papers, and as it came out in the assignments, it's often a good thing to have walked in people's shoes. It's good to have experienced what you are on the other side of. Like, if you know what it's like to be a patient, then when you are a clinician caring for someone, especially if they have the same condition you have so much more insight. You have so much more ways to help them because you've walked in their shoes. It's just a general truism in life. And there's a term for this. It's called narrative medicine. Narrative medicine is committed to developing a deep and accurate attention to the accounts of self, what it's like to be a patient that are told and heard in the context of healthcare. Whether in settings of individual clinical care, health promotion, or global health activism, our deepest mission is to improve healthcare by recognizing the persons who seek help with their health. When people have to go get health, when they're sick, they're not 100%. We're not 100%. And I am sure you all have experienced this. I have myself and the family members. By the time you're there in the clinician's office, you're not 100% because you're dealing with something that's forced you to go there. And what you're really hoping for is someone who has the time and the attention and the clinical intelligence and the social and emotional intelligence to get you through that, walk you through different stages, maybe not give you all the information and immediately like pace it out. And they even allow you to have a little denial at first. You don't have to acquiesce and just say, okay, it's good to have a little room for reaction. And that's the first article by Dr. Shakina Elmore and her whole life history of all kinds of ailments. And even now, she has a condition that makes her both a patient, she's not permanently cured of her conditions. She's gone through cancer, she's recovered. She has a continuing chronic condition. And that is like the fuel that enables, it's like her empathy fuel to keep being able to go into patients' rooms, walk them through really difficult situations, give them the biomedical science side, the medical side, but then also come alongside them and understand what it's like to be hearing that news because she's heard that. And as she wrote or it was written about her in this article, sometimes that's uncomfortable for clinicians. They want separations they want clear dichotomies of you're the patient, I'm the caregiver, and it gets messy and murky if you blend that or if you open up too much. And I think her argument is patients want that. They want you to understand at some level what they're experiencing. And especially if you've had that condition or something similar to it, you just have so much more insight and credibility to that patient. I know sometimes when I'm talking to a parent who's concerned about their child in college, when I tell them that we have a child in college, or they've had this or that, and the minute you say I've kind of been there with you, it just opens up a door of credibility and integrity that I think really, really helps. She says that herself. She says, she ends this article with a quote, "I help people in a way that I wouldn't be able to if I hadn't had all my experiences," she said. As a doctor, she added, "You are so lucky to be invited to help people in a really tangible, personal way. You have knowledge that is helpful. You have human skills that are helpful. It's so cool." And she also makes the point that if you work in healthcare as a clinician, the burnout factor Dr. Dan talked about this as well. Burnout is a big occupational risk in nursing, medicine, dentistry, and all of the clinician, especially right now, as you're seeing, nurses are being burnt out, and doctors are burnt out treating COVID. You've got to find ways. All caregivers have to find ways to refuel, recharge their empathy batteries, because they're not limitless, they're not infinite. And if you can pull on your own previous experiences as fuel for your empathy, you're going to be a happier clinician. You're going to be a more gratified, sustained clinician if you find ways to continually recharge your empathy and emotional batteries. If you're not aware of that need, then you're going to run out. It's going to shock you. And I hear about stories like that all the time. These really brilliant people that go into nursing and medical school, and then they get out and they're like, they hit a brick wall where, like, they have all the intelligence and the skills and the training, but what has depleted them is just the stuff they have to deal with. They get worn down by the health insurance system, electronic medical records, or just dealing with really tough stuff with people. And they didn't know that that's actually just as important as knowing all the book knowledge. Social and emotional intelligence, empathy, is critical for just professional sustenance. The next article I always include because the grace of denial, I already mentioned how we always think denial is a bad thing. And this is a doctor who all of a sudden finds herself in the situation where she is still a clinician, but now she's also kind of a semi-interpreter for her family and for her father, who has the worst diagnosis, one of the worst diagnoses, ALS. And you might think, so she would just, okay, she's going to deliver the news, she's going to come up with a plan. Even as a clinician, the beauty of this article, and I love that it's short, but it gets right to the point, which is, if clinicians, doctors, and nurses don't realize that patients often need time to absorb things, and they even need a little moment and space for denial, she learned it the hard way. She learned it dealing with trying to help her dad and her family manage a condition that can't be cured. And so if her denial and looking for an alternative diagnosis of Lyme disease, even though eventually the doctor's like, look, you got to face facts. That 6 months of quasi-denial was critical in them getting some quality. She got married, and it helped them. And I've seen cases, I've experienced where being in a room, clinician is giving news, and the person isn't exactly signing off on it. They're not saying, oh, I get it. There's like this just a stunned look in their face. Whenever you see a stunned face, your first instinct is, did I not make this clear? Do you not understand this? Do I need to print this out? Do I need to explain? Do I need to repeat myself for the 4th time? We just don't like when people aren't getting it. What aren't you getting? If you work in healthcare, they got it, or they got part of it, or maybe they didn't actually get a lot of it, but they got the basics of it. But they are just literally, it's going through their brain, their emotions, and they are literally in the act of processing something that is going to disrupt their day, their week, their month, their lives, their family. And nothing really prepares you for that, right? They are processing that. So denial, again, it's always I can't think of times when denial is thought of as okay or a good thing. The point of this article is that denial is a critical psychological, evolutionary, adaptive survival skill that is often deployed when you have just been run over with bad news bus, truck, train, and your body and your whole system, you're trying to be composed, because sometimes you're trying to stay together because the person next to you is falling apart, or the person is going to fall apart. And someone has to engage in a little denial so that they can get through the rest of that thing. And then they need a little denial for some more time, because they're going to be the one that's going to be part of the caregiving team. So just another article, another reading, another assignment that highlights, by a clinician, I love this, that highlights the importance of emotional and social intelligence in healthcare. This is the doctor, Heather Scher. And she went on to she went on another article. She's in Florida, and you ought to click on this. I didn't have room in the syllabus. What I saw treating the victims from Parkland should change the debate on guns. She talks about how in the United States, we allow these assault rifles to use ammunition that we only use in like wartime on the battlefield. Well, guess what? When that type of weapon is used in the United States in a school, it does the kind of damage to the human body that you can spend your whole life, if you're a non-clinician, you'll never see that. And maybe if we saw that, maybe if we didn't hide the ugly realities of life, her argument in this article is maybe the whole America should look at this. You should see the carnage. Like, don't have those things on the news that say, oh, we're not going to show this to you because it's too graphic. Show it. Show the truth. Because if people saw the truth, they might think differently. This is like the thing you always hope in education is walk a mile in someone else's shoes. See the truth. Understand what it's like to be a patient when you are a clinician. Understand that people aren't always in these dichotomous positions of healthy or sick or well or unwell. We're on a spectrum. But learn, like, walk, empathy, learn, walk, be in other people's shoes, see the truth. Let that inform your thinking. The last article we had is on rationing. And this article, of course, is in relation to the limits on ventilators during this COVID pandemic. And all of a sudden, we need policies at the hospital or the health system level on what do we do if you have more patients that need ventilators than have number of ventilators. And that is alien, really alien to almost all Americans and even most clinicians. That's sort of a military triage thing. In a state of war, people on the battlefield, you only have so much time with so many patients. You got to triage and put the most hurt and the most sick and wounded first, and then work your way back. It's a military concept of triage rationing. And now with this pandemic, we're having to think the most difficult bioethical thoughts of, well, what do you do? How do you do that? And by the way, you don't want doctors and nurses having to do this case by case, because then all you've done is do the most horrible emotional damage, psychological damage to the people that you're depending on, who are then going to be very traumatized. And as you saw, the one doctor up in New York who then returned to Charlottesville and committed suicide, if you don't get policies and plans at the health system level, it's going to fall down to individual clinicians day after day. And when that happens, they're going to suffer, not just physically, they're going to suffer emotionally. And this whole article is just like, how do you think the unthinkable? Because you can't say, well, we're just not going to do that. We're Americans. We don't ration. And rationing is just, that's communism. No. In fact, in life, we're always rationing. The first rule you learn in economics is scarcity. Is there enough housing that everybody wants everywhere all the time? No. To the students out there, are all the classes you want, have all the seats you want whenever you want them? No. In fact, classes are always limited. So we limit it. How do we limit access to classes? We limit access by the year. So the older students get it first, and then that's okay ethically because every student becomes an older student and then they get the class. We limit access to classes. Does every person that wants to come to the university get in? No. We have admissions because we have X number of spots. We have many more applicants. We have to have some system. Housing. Everybody wants to live in Gateway or the nice houses or the apartments. We don't have that. So we do it by year, or by preference, or by grade, or GPA. We have all these different ways of rationing. Life involves all kinds of rationing. And you can do it better, you can do it worse. And this COVID pandemic has forced clinicians and then more and more people to come to grips with the fact of, how do you do it? How do you do it ethically? How do you do it fairly? You can't just give it to the people who are rich and let them have all of that, because that's repugnant. You just can't. You might think, well, give it to the sickest people first. Well, what if the sickest person has an underlying heart condition and they're 90 years old and they're not even likely to survive? And that sounds inhumane, but right next to them, in the bed next to them, is a 30-year-old patient, young mom who just gave birth, has a child, and they're more likely to survive, and they have a child, and they haven't had the privilege of living to 90 yet, and you got one ventilator. So maybe there's a way you do that. Or you look at the underlying physiology, as they write in the article. Maybe you give the people who have the best chance of surviving, because if you give it to the people who have the least chance of surviving, then you're wasting the ventilator. Again, this is bioethics. This is how you figure out how to deal with situations we pretend don't exist or don't ever want to think exist. And then lo and behold, they come, and now we have to think about that. And the worst thing you can do is not think about it and not plan and just say, oh, well, just pretend it's not there. Actually, this is where denial, you have to actually stop denial at this point and say, the first instinct is to be in denial about limited amounts of personal protective gear or limited amounts of ventilators, or what we might find next year is a limited amount of vaccines. What are we going to do when we have vaccines? How about the first round of vaccines go to people on the front lines? And that's another criteria for sometimes figuring out who gets a ventilator. Well, if it's between Rick Mays and Dr. So-and-so, who's a respiratory therapist or a pulmonologist or a nurse, tough me is probably going to go to the clinician on the front lines because they can save 10 other people. I can't save anybody. So maybe it's hard for me to even say that. Hey, wait a minute. I kind of don't want to give up the ventilator, but in the world we live in an element of scarcity, these are the bioethical decisions you have to make. And hopefully you do them with empathy, but you also do them with fairness and justice. And then we close I purposely put this TED Talk at the end, even though I think most of you watching this aren't necessarily millennials anymore. You guys are iGen or Gen Z, but you guys are very close cousins of millennials. And I hope iGen, Gen Z forms a Game of Thrones coalition with millennials, and you kick the boomers, and I guess you could kick us out too. We're generation, what are we? Next. We're the generation after the boomers and before millennials. But definitely kick the boomers out. The boomers have had their turn. Love them. They're our family members. But it's just nice to see a younger generation say, yeah, the system can wear you down. The medicine is great. Caring for people is great. The system can wear you down. But, in the end, push back. And the argument he poses is actually backed up by research that health systems led by clinicians who understand both the business side, but they also treat patients. That's where you get that social emotional intelligence in the boardroom, who say, yes, I know we understand we have economic and financial issues that we have to reconcile. But at the end of the day, this is a health system, and that has to be squared with the first mission, which is caring for people. And if you just run it like a pure business and you only think profit and revenue, then you are losing sight of the mission. And if you're not fulfilling the mission, then you're fulfilling other objectives that any other business, which is fine if you want to sell more cars or more, mutual funds, but then be in the mutual fund business and be in the car business. If you're a hospital, if you're a health system, your mission should be patient care, and it should be healthcare and medicine and taking care of patients. And it might take millennials to kind of reclaim some of that, because it's valuable sometimes for young adults to say, wait a minute, why are we doing that? That doesn't seem right. Because older people like myself and my parents, one of the things that happens as you get older is you get habituated. At first you're shocked by some of these things, and then after time you're like, okay, you get less shocked, and then all of a sudden you're kind of part of the system and you have rationalized it. And as you get older, you have more to lose, like your mortgage, or you're taking care of your kids, or you're more compromised. When you're younger, you're single, and you're less habituated, less acclimated to the trade-offs that sometimes we force on people in these systems. That's the time to say, no, this is ridiculous, or this is unacceptable, or why are we doing this? They just ask the question, push back. And then his example is be a clinician, but also have the training to be an administrator in the business side, and then reconcile those as best you can. That's when the best system comes out. All right, enjoy the rest of it. And I look forward to seeing your discussion, comments, and the rest of your papers. Thank you, guys. Take care.
You have stopped screen share.